Good morning, good afternoon, seventh graders. Hope you guys are doing well. Today, we're looking at Chapter 6, the American Revolution, which is going to be an 8-year war starting in 1775. We learned in our last lesson it began in April of 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord and the shot heard around the world. It will last until 1783, although most of the fighting will end by 1781. The Treaty of Paris officially will end the war in 1783. Chapter 6, Section 1 is going to discuss fighting in the North. Fighting in the North will begin primarily in the New England states, Massachusetts. We're going to talk about Massachusetts and a little bit about New York. Chapter 6, Section 1, the fighting beginning in the North. Let's look at our vocab terms first, and there are 3 on the reading that we're going to look at here at the top of the page. There are 8 vocab terms total in Chapter 6, Section 1, and the remaining 5 words, these 3 on the top here, and the remaining 5 can be found the full deck on your Quizlet set, which I've also posted on Google Classroom for you. So looking at the first word, we've got patriot, a colonist who favored war and independence from Britain. Patriot is a colonist who favored war against and independence from Britain. A loyalist is a colonist who remained loyal to Britain. Colonist that was a loyalist would have been a colonist who did not support the colonies rebelling against the mother country. Loyalists were loyal to Britain. Blockade was the shutting of a port to keep people and supplies from moving in and out. Blockade, the shutting of a seaport to keep people and supplies from coming in or out of the port. So beginning with our reading today about fighting in the North and picking up on our discussion of Chapter 5, Section 3 with the start of the Revolution with the battles of Lexington and Concord. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, American colonists still hoped to avoid war with Britain. After all, they were going up against the most powerful army and most powerful navy in the world. The colonists still held out some degree of hope, although it was faint, that they could avoid full-scale war with Britain. In 1775, the Second Continental Congress met to decide the colony's future. And the delegates came up with a plan called the Olive Branch Petition, which they would send to King George III. And in this petition, they declared their loyalty, but asked the king to repeal the intolerable acts. We're going to talk in class about this, and what's kind of ironic here, with the Olive Branch Petition, they're swearing loyalty to England, and they're asking the king to repeal the intolerable acts, and they're asking him to do that at probably the worst possible time after blood has been shed at Lexington and Concord. Worst time to ask the king for what amounts to a favor, repealing the intolerable acts, is being asked when American colonists have killed and injured scores of British soldiers at Lexington and Concord. At the same time, the Congress forms the First Continental Army. So while they're hoping for peace, while the political leaders in the 13 colonies are hoping for peace, the First Continental Army is established, and it's appointing George Washington to lead it. So while the politicians are hoping for peace, the military leaders are continuing to prepare for war with the creation of the Continental Army. Continuing on, although, that's tough, misspelling in the worksheet. I'll have to let the company know about that. The word although is spelled incorrectly. So I'll see if I can get that fixed. Although only a third of the colonists claimed to be patriots, another third were loyalists, and the final third were neutral. Okay, war with Britain was appearing likely, especially after Lexington and Concord. And as we talked about in class, after blood is spilled, after there's violence, after people are killed at Lexington and Concord, it is very, very difficult to walk back after blood has been spilled. It's kind of like closing the barn door after the horses have gotten out. Once blood has been shed, it's going to be very, very difficult to avoid warfare on a larger scale after Lexington had conquered. Now, at the beginning of the war, the British appeared to have many advantages, and we will talk specifically about the specific advantages that they have. However, the colonists also had some factors in their favor, and we will look at that in a moment when we look at the chart. The main disadvantage for the British troops was their distance from home. They're fighting 3,000 miles away from England. They're fighting across the Atlantic Ocean. They're fighting in a land that they are not very familiar with, a territory that they're not very familiar with. And this is important. The main disadvantage for the British troops was the distance from home and the fact that they're not fighting on their home turf. Also, the colonists' lack of training put them at a disadvantage too. There weren't a lot of experienced soldiers, full-time professional soldiers in the Continental Army when the war starts. So that is significant as well as far as a disadvantage for the colonists. During the first year of the war, the two sides would fight over Boston. Most of the fighting and most of the focal points of the first year are going to center in and around the Boston area. British troops controlled the city, but Americans held the surrounding area, keeping the British from marching out. In January of 1776, Americans set up cannons on the heights overlooking Boston Harbor. Those cannons, by the way, we will learn in class, would be seized from New York State by the Green Mountain Boys, and we'll talk about that in detail in class. Those cannons were placed on the harbor overlooking Boston Harbor, where British ships were docked, and the British commander, General Howe, realized he could no longer hold the city. He withdrew his troops to Halifax, Canada, early in 1776, and after Howe's retreat, however, the British Navy used its powerful fleet to set up a blockade of all colonial ports. So while the British Navy leaves Boston and their soldiers leave Boston, they are not quitting. They are not surrendering. They're simply retreating and regrouping, and they're going to use that time to regroup to establish a blockade of pretty much every major colonial city up and down the eastern seaboard. This blockade will be used to close all colonial ports, and the blockade eventually cut the colonies off from the rest of the world. That would be the game plan for the British after they leave the city of Boston in January of 1776. Let's look at our chart at the bottom half of the page. The chart is titled Advantages that Each Side Would Have in the American Revolution. On the left-hand side of the chart, you've got the British advantages, and on the right-hand side of the chart, you've got the colonists' advantages. Let's first look at the British advantages. They had well-trained, experienced troops. The British had a professional army of 24/7 soldiers, and they were the most well-trained and the most experienced troops in the world. They also had the world's most powerful navy. The world's most powerful navy, bar none. The American Navy did not even exist at the start of the war. The British had the most powerful navy in the world. So both the Army and the Navy going up against the colonists appear at the start of the war to be greatly in the British favor. Also, the British had mercenary troops. Mercenary troops are troops for hire, troops that live in a foreign country that were not British, but basically were hired out by the British to basically work for the British Army and Navy as soldiers and sailors. We will see some of these mercenary troops in the local Battle of Bennington and the Battle of Walloomsac, where we will see soldiers from Europe and Germany participate in the Battle of Hoosick and the Battle of Bennington/Walloomsac. All right. Over on the colonist side, the advantages that the colonists are going to have at the start of the war, they are going to have George Washington, who is a very strong leader. They are going to be fighting to defend their homeland. they're fighting on their home field, to use a sports analogy. They're fighting on their home turf. That is a powerful advantage. They know the land, they know the geography, and also they have many experienced soldiers, many experienced men who are accomplished and know how to use a rifle. Now, a lot of their experience with rifles does not come from warfare or combat, comes from hunting and using their rifles to find food for their families. But nonetheless, they are experienced with guns, which is going to be a colonist advantage throughout the war. So the two questions at the bottom of the worksheet. Question 1, how did the Americans gain control of Boston? Question 1 is going to be addressed in the reading. So take a moment to answer question 1 and locate it on the reading. How did the colonists gain control of Boston? And question 2 is going to relate specifically to the chart that appears below the reading, right up above here. And chart skills question 2, identify 2 advantages that the British had as the war began. Identify 2 advantages the British had as the war began. Take a moment to locate the answer to that question using the chart, and then be mindful that your vocab for this deck, 6 section 1, is located on your Quizlet page, and also I typically will update your Google Classroom page daily with that particular week's vocab terms. Next up, Chapter 6, Section 2, we will talk about the colonies declaring their independence in 1776. Looking forward to that. Until then, we'll see you next time, guys. Be safe.